On February 8, 1951, Dr. George Gay peered into his microscope at Johns Hopkins Hospital and witnessed something that would change medicine forever. The cells before him, taken from a 31-year-old African-American woman named Henrietta Lacks, were doing something human cells had never done in laboratory conditions. They were dividing, multiplying, and thriving outside the human body.
For decades, scientists had attempted to grow human tissue in laboratory dishes, only to watch the cells weaken and die within days. These cells were different. They doubled every 24 hours, growing with an aggressive vitality that matched the cancer consuming their donor. Gay labeled them HeLa, using the first two letters of Henrietta's first and last names, unknowingly creating the most important cell line in medical history. While Henrietta lay dying in the segregated wards of Johns Hopkins, her cells began a journey that would outlive her by decades and travel to laboratories around the world. They would help develop the polio vaccine, advance cancer research, and contribute to countless medical breakthroughs that would save millions of lives. Yet the woman whose body produced this scientific miracle would die in poverty, never knowing that her cells would become immortal or that her unwitting contribution would revolutionize human medicine. Henrietta Pleasant was born on the 1st of August, 1920, in the same tobacco fields of Roanoke, Virginia, where her ancestors had been enslaved for generations. The small wooden cabin where she entered the world sat on land that her great-great-grandmother had worked without wages, and where her family continued to labor as sharecroppers in a system that differed from slavery more in name than in practice. When Henrietta was 4 years old, her mother Eliza died in childbirth, leaving 10 children to be distributed among relatives who could barely feed their own families. Henrietta went to live with her grandfather Tommy Lacks in a log cabin that had once served as slave quarters on the former Lacks plantation. The irony was not lost on the family that they now lived in the same structures where their ancestors had been held in bondage. Tommy Lacks was a stern but caring man who worked the tobacco fields from dawn to dusk and expected the same from his grandchildren. Henrietta learned to plant, tend, and harvest tobacco before she could read, her small hands becoming skilled at the delicate work of handling the valuable leaves that would be sold to cigarette companies. The work was backbreaking and the pay minimal, but it was the only life available to poor black families in rural Virginia. Education was a luxury that few could afford in the Pleasant family. The one-room schoolhouse for black children was poorly funded and understaffed, operating only when the tobacco harvest didn't require every available hand in the fields. Henrietta attended sporadically, learning basic reading and writing skills but never advancing beyond elementary levels. Her real education came from the hard lessons of poverty, racism, and survival in the rural South. Despite the harsh circumstances, Henrietta developed a vibrant personality that drew people to her. She was known for her infectious laugh, her love of dancing, and her fierce loyalty to family and friends. Neighbors remembered her as someone who would share her last dollar with anyone in need, even when her own family struggled to put food on the table. At 14, Henrietta began a relationship with her cousin David Lacks, called Day by everyone who knew him. Cousin marriages were common in the isolated rural communities where young people had limited opportunities to meet potential partners outside their extended families. Day was a quiet, hard-working man who shared Henrietta's dreams of escaping the poverty and limited prospects of rural Virginia. The couple's first child, Lawrence, was born when Henrietta was just 16, followed by Lucille 2 years later. The young family continued working the tobacco fields while dreaming of better opportunities beyond the Virginia countryside. Their chance came during World War II when defense plants in Baltimore began recruiting workers, offering wages that seemed enormous compared to sharecropping income. In 1941, Henrietta and Day joined the Great Migration of African Americans leaving the rural South for industrial opportunities in northern cities. They settled in Turner Station, Maryland, a thriving community built around the Bethlehem Steel shipyard that was producing vessels for the war effort. The move represented hope for a better life. even though they would face new forms of discrimination in their adopted home. Turner Station was a remarkable community, one of the first planned suburbs for African Americans in the United States. Built by Bethlehem Steel to house black workers who were excluded from white neighborhoods, it featured modern homes with electricity, indoor plumbing, and central heating, luxuries that Henrietta had never experienced. The community fostered a strong sense of pride and mutual support among residents who had escaped the poverty of the rural South. Day found steady work at the steel mill, earning wages that allowed the family to live more comfortably than they ever had in Virginia. Henrietta threw herself into community life, joining the local Baptist church and participating in neighborhood social activities. She was known for her generosity, often cooking meals for sick neighbors or watching their children while they worked. Her home became a gathering place for family and friends who appreciated her warmth and hospitality. The Lacks family continued to grow in Turner Station, with 3 more children born during the 1,942. David Jr., called Sonny, was born in 1942, followed by Deborah in 1949 and Joseph in 1950. Henrietta was a devoted mother who worked hard to provide opportunities for her children that she had never had. She insisted they attend school regularly and dreamed of them attending college, goals that seemed achievable in their new community. Despite the improved living conditions, the family still faced the daily realities of segregation and racism. The children attended underfunded black schools, medical care was limited to segregated facilities, and job opportunities remained restricted by color barriers. Henrietta and Day understood that their children would face obstacles because of their race, but they believed that education and hard work could overcome most barriers. Henrietta's personality flourished in Turner Station, where she became known for her love of dancing, her fashionable clothes, and her infectious joy in life. She frequented local dance halls and social clubs, always impeccably dressed despite the family's modest income. Neighbors remembered her as someone who could light up a room with her smile and make everyone feel welcome at community gatherings. The community provided a support network that helped families cope with the challenges of industrial life and ongoing discrimination. Children played safely in the streets, while adults worked long shifts at the steel mill or other local industries. Churches, social clubs, and neighborhood organizations created bonds that sustained residents through difficult times and celebrated their successes. By 1950, Henrietta seemed to have achieved the American dream available to African Americans of her generation. She had a stable marriage, healthy children, a comfortable home, and an active role in a thriving community. The future appeared bright for the Lacks family as they established themselves in Turner Station and planned for their children's education and advancement. Johns Hopkins Hospital had opened in 1889 with a mission to provide medical care regardless of patients' ability to pay, making it one of the few institutions in the segregated South that treated African American patients. By 1951, the hospital's charity ward served thousands of poor black patients who had nowhere else to turn for medical care. This patient population also provided a convenient source of research subjects for medical experiments conducted without their knowledge or consent. The hospital's complex legacy reflected the contradictions of American medicine in the early 20th century. While Johns Hopkins physicians made groundbreaking discoveries that advanced medical knowledge, they often did so by exploiting vulnerable patients who lacked the education or resources to understand what was being done to them. The charity ward operated under the assumption that free medical care justified using patients for research purposes without their explicit permission. Dr. Howard Jones, a prominent gynecologist at Johns Hopkins, first examined Henrietta Lacks on the 29th of January, 1951, when she came to the hospital complaining of vaginal bleeding and pelvic pain. The 1-year-old mother had delayed seeking medical care due to the cost and her distrust of white doctors, but the symptoms had become too severe to ignore. Jones discovered a large, aggressive tumor on her cervix that he immediately recognized as malignant. The medical practices of 1,000 951 reflected a paternalistic approach that gave doctors nearly absolute authority over patient care decisions. Informed consent was not required or even considered necessary, as physicians believed that patients lacked the education to understand complex medical procedures. This attitude was particularly pronounced when treating poor, uneducated patients who were viewed as grateful recipients of charity care rather than autonomous individuals with rights. Jones scheduled Henrietta for radium treatment, the standard therapy for cervical cancer, in 1951. The procedure involved inserting radioactive tubes into her cervix to kill cancer cells, a painful and often ineffective treatment that frequently caused severe side effects. Before beginning the therapy, Jones removed samples of both cancerous and healthy tissue from Henrietta's cervix, following a routine practice of collecting specimens for research purposes. The tissue samples were sent to Dr. George Gay's laboratory, where he had spent decades attempting to grow human cells in culture for medical research. Gay understood that successful cell cultures would revolutionize medical research by providing unlimited supplies of human tissue for testing drugs, studying diseases, and developing treatments. His previous attempts had failed because normal human cells died quickly in laboratory conditions. Gay's laboratory reflected the racial attitudes of 1952 medicine, with black patients referred to by their race rather than their names, and their tissue treated as raw material for scientific advancement. The idea that patients might have rights regarding their tissue or deserve compensation for contributing to medical research was not seriously considered by the medical establishment. Charity patients were expected to be grateful for free treatment and to contribute to medical knowledge as part of their obligation. The relationship between Johns Hopkins and Baltimore's African American community was complicated by both dependence and exploitation. The hospital provided essential medical services that were unavailable elsewhere due to segregation, but it also conducted research on black patients that would have been unthinkable with white, paying patients. This dynamic reflected broader patterns of racial exploitation that characterized American society in the mid-20th century. On the 8th of February, 1951, Dr. George Gay made the discovery that would revolutionize medical research when he observed Henrietta's cells thriving in laboratory conditions. Unlike every previous human cell sample he had studied, these cells divided aggressively and showed no signs of aging or dying. Within 24 hours, they had doubled in number. And they continued growing at an unprecedented rate that amazed Gay and his research team. The scientific significance of immortal human cells was immediately apparent to Gay, who had spent his career searching for exactly this breakthrough. Human cell cultures would allow researchers to test treatments, study diseases, and conduct experiments that were impossible with animal models or limited tissue samples. Gay began distributing HeLa cells to researchers around the world, launching a scientific revolution that would transform modern medicine. Henrietta's cancer proved as aggressive as her cells, spreading rapidly throughout her body despite the radium treatments she received at Johns Hopkins. The therapy caused severe pain and side effects while failing to halt the disease's progression. By summer 1951, cancer had invaded her kidneys, liver, and lungs, causing excruciating pain that morphine could barely control. Henrietta spent her final months in agony, unaware that her cells were already being cultured in laboratories across the country. The medical team treating Henrietta never informed her that her cells had been taken for research purposes, nor did they explain that these cells were being distributed to other researchers. Such disclosure was not required in 1951, when patient consent was not considered necessary for tissue research. Henrietta died believing that her only contribution to medicine was her participation in experimental cancer treatments that had failed to save her life. On the 4th of October 1951, Henrietta Lacks died at Johns Hopkins Hospital, surrounded by family members who struggled to understand how quickly the disease had claimed their vibrant wife and mother. She was buried in an unmarked grave in a family cemetery in rural Virginia, returning to the tobacco fields where her life had begun. The woman who would become one of the most important figures in medical history died in poverty and obscurity. Meanwhile, HeLa cells continued growing in laboratories around the world, reproducing with the same aggressive vitality that had characterized Henrietta's cancer. Researchers marveled at the cells' hardiness and rapid growth, using them for experiments that would have been impossible with previous tissue cultures. And the cells survived freezing, thawing, shipping, and rough handling that would have killed normal human cells. Within months of Henrietta's death, HeLa cells had become the standard tool for medical research, used in laboratories from California to Tokyo. Researchers studying polio, cancer, influenza, and countless other diseases relied on these immortal cells for their experiments. The woman whose name was reduced to a laboratory code had unknowingly become the foundation of modern cellular research. The irony of Henrietta's contribution to medical science became apparent as her cells enabled discoveries that would save millions of lives while her own family continued to struggle with poverty and limited access to healthcare. The same medical system that had failed to save Henrietta's life was using her cells to advance treatments that would benefit future patients, creating a legacy that was both magnificent and morally troubling. The development of the polio vaccine represented the first major medical breakthrough achieved using HeLa cells, demonstrating their revolutionary potential for medical research. Dr. Jonas Salk used Henrietta's cells to test his vaccine in 1952, growing massive quantities of poliovirus in HeLa cultures to produce enough material for large-scale testing. The cell's ability to support viral growth made possible the rapid development and testing that led to the vaccine's approval and distribution. The success of the polio vaccine transformed HeLa cells from a laboratory curiosity into an essential tool for medical research. The National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis established the first commercial cell culture facility, producing enormous quantities of HeLa cells for distribution to researchers worldwide. By 1954, HeLa cells were being shipped to laboratories in over 25 countries, enabling international collaboration in medical research that had been impossible before Immortal cell lines became available. Cancer research experienced unprecedented advancement as scientists used HeLa cells to study how malignant cells grew, divided, and responded to potential treatments. The cells' cancerous origin made them ideal models for understanding the disease that had killed their donor. Researchers tested chemotherapy drugs, radiation treatments, and experimental therapies on HeLa cultures, developing protocols that would save countless cancer patients in the decades following Henrietta's death. The space program relied on HeLa cells to study the effects of weightlessness and radiation on human tissue, sending Henrietta's cells into orbit years before the first human astronauts. NASA scientists used the cells to understand how space travel might affect the human body, contributing to the safety protocols that made human space exploration possible. Henrietta's cells literally traveled beyond Earth's atmosphere, participating in humanity's expansion into space. Influenza research advanced rapidly using HeLa cells to grow large quantities of viral samples for vaccine development and testing. The annual flu vaccine that protects millions of people worldwide relies on techniques first developed using Henrietta's immortal cells. Researchers studying HIV divided by AIDS in the 1980 seconds used HeLa cells to understand how the virus infected human cells and to test potential treatments, accelerating the development of life-saving antiretroviral drugs. The commercial potential of HeLa cells became apparent as biotechnology companies built massive industries around cell culture technology. Companies like Microbiological Associates generated millions of dollars in revenue by growing and selling HeLa cells to researchers, while pharmaceutical companies used the cells to test new drugs before expensive human trials. The cells that had cost nothing to obtain became the foundation of billion-dollar industries. Chromosome research experienced a breakthrough when scientists used HeLa cells to develop techniques for studying human genetics. The cell's robust growth made possible the detailed analysis of human chromosomes that led to discoveries about genetic diseases, heredity, and the role of DNA in cellular function. These advances laid the groundwork for the Human Genome Project and modern genetic medicine. By the 1960s, HeLa cells had become so ubiquitous in medical research that most scientists forgot their human origin. The cells were simply a tool, as essential to biological research as microscopes or test tubes. Henrietta Lacks had become invisible, her identity obscured by scientific nomenclature that reduced her to a laboratory code. The woman whose cells enabled countless medical miracles had been forgotten by the very community that owed her such an enormous debt. For over 2 decades after Henrietta's death, the Lacks family remained completely unaware that her cells continued to grow in laboratories around the world. They struggled with poverty in Turner Station, while scientists and biotechnology companies generated enormous profits using tissue taken from their deceased mother and wife. The family's ignorance of Henrietta's scientific legacy reflected the broader exclusion of African Americans from the benefits of medical advances they had unknowingly helped to create. Lacks worked double shifts at the steel mill to support his 5 children alone, never remarrying after Henrietta's death. The family faced constant financial pressure as Day's wages barely covered basic necessities like food, clothing, and housing. Medical care remained a luxury they could rarely afford. Despite living just miles from Johns Hopkins Hospital where Henrietta's cells were enabling revolutionary medical discoveries. The Lacks children grew up without understanding why their mother had died or what had happened to her at Johns Hopkins Hospital. Day rarely discussed Henrietta's illness or death, and the children learned to avoid asking questions that caused their father obvious pain. They knew their mother had died of cancer, but the details of her treatment and the circumstances surrounding her death remained family secrets that were too painful to examine. Education remained a challenge for the Lacks children, who attended underfunded, segregated schools while dealing with the emotional trauma of losing their mother at young ages. Lawrence and Sonny dropped out of high school to work and help support the family, while the younger children struggled academically without adequate support at home or school. The cycle of poverty that had trapped previous generations continued to limit their opportunities for advancement. In 1973, the family's world changed when scientists contacted them, requesting blood samples for genetic research related to HeLa cells. The initial contact was confusing and frightening, with researchers using technical language that the family could not understand. They were told that Henrietta's cells were still alive and being used for medical research, information that seemed impossible to believe and deeply disturbing to contemplate. The revelation that Henrietta's cells were immortal and valuable created a mixture of pride and anger among family members. They were proud that their mother had contributed to medical science and saved lives, but they were furious that they had been excluded from decisions about her tissue and had received no compensation for her contributions. The discovery of HeLa cells forced the family to confront questions about medical exploitation and racial injustice that they were unprepared to address. Subsequent contacts with researchers were often insensitive and exploitative, with scientists treating family members as sources of genetic material rather than as grieving relatives with legitimate concerns about their mother's legacy. Researchers requested blood samples, family medical histories, and personal information without adequately explaining their purposes or obtaining proper informed consent. The family felt like they were being used again, just as their mother had been used without her knowledge. The lack of compensation for Henrietta's contribution became a source of ongoing frustration as family members learned about the massive commercial success of HeLa cells. They struggled to afford basic health care while companies made millions of dollars selling their mother's cells. The economic inequality highlighted the broader patterns of exploitation that had characterized their family's relationship with the medical establishment since Henrietta's death. The Henrietta Lacks case emerged as a powerful symbol of medical exploitation during the 1972 civil rights movement, when African Americans began challenging systemic discrimination in healthcare and medical research. Bioethicists and patient advocates pointed to HeLa cells as evidence of how the medical establishment had historically treated poor and minority patients as sources of research material, rather than as autonomous individuals with rights and dignity. The development of informed consent protocols in medical research was influenced partly by cases like Henrietta Lacks, where patients had unknowingly contributed to scientific advances without their permission. The Nuremberg Code and Declaration of Helsinki established international standards requiring voluntary consent for medical experiments, but these principles were often ignored when dealing with charity patients who were viewed as having limited rights. Legal questions about tissue ownership became increasingly complex, as biotechnology companies generated enormous profits from human cell lines and genetic material. Courts struggled to balance the rights of patients and their families against the needs of scientific research and commercial development. The Henrietta Lacks case highlighted the absence of clear legal frameworks for addressing these issues, leaving patients vulnerable to exploitation. The racial dimensions of medical exploitation became apparent as researchers documented how African Americans had been disproportionately subjected to medical experimentation without their consent. From the Tuskegee syphilis study to the forced sterilization of poor women, the medical establishment had a long history of treating black patients as research subjects rather than as people deserving respectful care. Henrietta's story fit this pattern of exploitation disguised as medical advancement. University researchers and biotechnology companies defended their use of HeLa cells by arguing that the scientific benefits justified the original acquisition without consent. They claimed that requiring compensation for tissue donations would impede medical research and ultimately harm patients who might benefit from new treatments. This utilitarian argument ignored the fundamental questions of justice and respect for persons that bioethicists increasingly emphasized. The emergence of bioethics as an academic discipline was partly motivated by cases like Henrietta Lacks that revealed the moral complexities of modern medical research. Bioethicists developed frameworks for analyzing the competing obligations of researchers, patients, and society, emphasizing principles like autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. These principles provided tools for evaluating historical cases and preventing future exploitation. International human rights organizations began addressing the issue of medical exploitation in developing countries, where pharmaceutical companies often conducted research using standards that would be unacceptable in wealthy nations. The Henrietta Lacks case provided a powerful example of how vulnerable populations could be exploited for medical research, even in advanced countries with strong legal systems and ethical oversight. The question of whether patients or their families deserved compensation for commercially valuable tissue remained controversial throughout the bioethics community. Some argued that compensation would create perverse incentives and commercialize the human body in unacceptable ways, while others insisted that basic fairness required sharing profits with those who provided valuable biological material. The debate reflected broader disagreements about the proper relationship between medical research and commercial interests. Science writer Rebecca Skloot first learned about Henrietta Lacks in a community college biology class in 1988, when her instructor mentioned HeLa cells in passing without explaining their human origin. Skloot was struck by the brief reference to a woman whose cells had revolutionized medicine, and she spent the next decade trying to learn more about Henrietta's story. Her investigation would eventually bridge the gap between scientific achievement and human tragedy. Skloot's research revealed the shocking extent to which the Lacks family had been excluded from their mother's scientific legacy. She discovered that while HeLa cells had generated billions of dollars in profits and enabled countless medical breakthroughs, Henrietta's children and grandchildren remained poor and often lacked access to basic health care. The contrast between the cell's scientific value and the family's poverty highlighted fundamental questions about justice and exploitation in medical research. Building trust with the Lacks family required years of patient relationship building, as family members had been repeatedly disappointed and exploited by researchers and journalists who sought to use them for their own purposes. Skloot demonstrated genuine concern for the family's welfare and spent considerable time helping them understand the scientific concepts related to their mother's cells. Her approach differed dramatically from previous contacts that had treated the family as sources of information rather than as partners in understanding Henrietta's legacy. The complexity of explaining HeLa cells to family members who lacked scientific education revealed the broader challenges of science communication and health literacy. Skloot had to translate complex biological concepts into language that the family could understand while respecting their intelligence and addressing their emotional needs. The process highlighted how scientific illiteracy can perpetuate exploitation and exclude communities from discussions about research that affects them directly. Deborah Lacks, Henrietta's daughter, became Skloot's primary collaborator and the emotional center of the investigation. Deborah had spent decades wondering about her mother's cells and their significance, struggling to understand scientific explanations that seemed to conflict with her religious beliefs and emotional needs. Her partnership with Skloot represented the first time anyone had seriously attempted to help her understand her mother's scientific legacy. The investigation revealed disturbing details about how the medical establishment had continued to exploit the Lacks family long after Henrietta's death. Researchers had contacted family members for genetic samples without adequate explanation or consent, treating them as sources of biological material rather than as people deserving respectful treatment. These interactions had left family members confused, angry, and suspicious of anyone claiming interest in their mother's story. Skloot's book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, published in 2010, brought international attention to the ethical issues surrounding medical research and tissue ownership. The book became a bestseller and was adapted for film and television, introducing millions of people to Henrietta's story and the broader questions it raised about exploitation, racism, and justice in medical research. The public response demonstrated widespread concern about these issues. The relationship between Skloot and the Lacks family evolved beyond simple research collaboration to become a complex partnership that addressed both historical injustices and ongoing needs. Skloot established a foundation to support the family's education and healthcare needs, while advocating for broader reforms in how researchers interact with communities affected by medical research. Her work demonstrated that responsible science communication could help address historical wrongs while promoting better practices for the future. 70 years after her death, Henrietta Lacks has achieved a form of immortality that extends far beyond her cells. Her story transformed from medical footnote to moral reckoning, forcing the scientific community to confront uncomfortable truths about exploitation disguised as progress. Modern informed consent protocols, bioethics education, and patient advocacy measures all bear the imprint of lessons learned from her case. HeLa cells continue their vital work in laboratories worldwide, contributing to COVID-19 vaccines, cancer treatments, and countless medical breakthroughs that save lives daily. Scientists estimate that research using Henrietta's cells has prevented millions of deaths, fulfilling the promise of medical advancement while highlighting the human cost of scientific progress achieved without consent. The Henrietta Lacks Foundation now provides education and healthcare support to her family, a small measure of justice for decades of exclusion from the benefits of her contribution. Yet fundamental questions remain unresolved about medical exploitation, racial inequality, and the distribution of profits from human biological material. Henrietta's transformation from anonymous victim to celebrated contributor represents both progress and persistent injustice. Her legacy serves as a reminder that scientific achievement built on exploitation carries moral debts that recognition alone cannot repay. In laboratories around the world, her cells continue dividing, growing, contributing to human knowledge, carrying within them both the promise of medical miracles and the weight of unresolved ethical questions about dignity, consent, and justice in the pursuit of scientific truth.